Thank you all and welcome to our 7th annual Egon J. Salmon and family commemoration of Kristallnacht and the St. Louis. I'm Lori Weintraub, the director of the Wagner College Holocaust Center. I'm so excited to see so many of you here in person to welcome the Salmon family at this really important anniversary moment, turning point, which honors the foresight of Egon Salmon in creating and founding this event, and to have 4 living survivors of the St. Louis, including Egon's sister Edith, who are on Zoom and who will join us in later for the Q&A. And now I will call upon John Salmon to introduce the event.
I forgot to make the print bigger. Wrong glasses. Oh, there it is. Okay. 10 years ago, Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel spoke at Wagner College. But 2 years earlier, in 2010, my dad, Egon J. Salmon, spoke to the students about his experiences in Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. His talk came first and inspired the growth of the Wagner College Holocaust Center. Wagner College wove together the stories of many Staten Island Holocaust survivors, some who rarely spoke or who had never spoken publicly about their tragic experiences. The Salmon family is particularly proud that Dad had the foresight to ensure, even as survivors passed on, the anniversary of Kristallnacht and the difficult voyage of the St. Louis and all it represents would not be forgotten in our community of Staten Island. My parents, both Egon and Marie, endowed this annual event, and much similar to the telling of the story of Passover, we return to it every year so that no one ever forgets. The 7th commemoration is our first one without him. We are grateful that our family history is enshrined in the newly opened Holocaust Education and Action Center, where students can daily see his photo, and read his history. In fact, yesterday, 3 grades of students from the Jewish Foundation School of Staten Island heard and discussed his words as a witness when he left Nazi Germany, as presented by Wagner College students of all faiths and races. 84 years ago, on November 9th and 10th, 1938, a Nazi coordinated attack of anti-Semitic destruction and murder swept across Germany, Austria, and part of Czechoslovakia. More than 267 synagogues were burned, 91 Jews killed, and 30,000 Jewish men arrested, including my grandfather Paul, whose shop windows were among the thousands shattered in this night of broken glass. This wave of violence was accompanied by the loss of rights and appropriation of property of German and Austrian Jewish citizens. As the Jews attempted to flee, as they became refugees, very few nations were willing to take them in, which is the focus of our program tonight. In May 1939, the German ship St. Louis sailed from Hamburg, Germany to Havana, Cuba, with 938 passengers, including my dad, Egon, my Aunt Edith, watching on Zoom. Hi, Aunt Edith. My grandmother, Erna, and other relatives, including a second cousin, Joseph, whose granddaughter is speaking tonight, Joan Loeb. When they arrived in Cuba, they were refused entry. The United States and Canada were unwilling to admit the passengers, and as my dad often reminded us, he spent his 15th birthday looking at the lights of Miami while being sent back to Nazi Germany. Our speaker, Susan Slater's mother, Bella Eisner, was also a passenger, and we are joined on Zoom by 3 other passengers, including cantor Judy Coppell-Stell, whose parents were among 254 passengers, 1/3 of the passengers who would not survive the Holocaust. Landing in France, they were sent to Gurs concentration camp and then to Auschwitz. Susan's father experienced a similarly tragic fate. We are here to never forget this history and learn what lessons we can from this tragedy, this moment of rising anti-Semitism. It's my honor to present Angelo Aramo, the president of Wagner College.
Thanks, John. And I want to thank you all for coming tonight, both here and on Zoom. And thank you for your support for this, our 7th annual commemoration of Kristallnacht in the St. Louis, but also for your support of our Wagner College Holocaust Center. You know, a year ago was the first, well, I was asked to become president in October of 2021. And this event last year was the first public event that I spoke at. And one of the things I remember talking about, and that we talked about that night, was the rising tide of anti-Semitism and also anti-democratic forces around the world. And, you know, it's hard to deny that a year later, in many ways, it's even worse. Certainly in the last month in the United States, the incidents of anti-Semitism have risen dramatically. And if you think back a year ago, I certainly did not really think that Russia was going to invade the Ukraine. And also that 9 months later, people almost yawn about it in most of the world. I mean, it's going on, but it's just going on. And when you think of those things, you know, the importance of a Holocaust Center like we have here at Wagner College, you know, history and the present intertwine. And events of the present are impacted by events of the past. And I think it's very important that we understand vigilance, right? You can internally, right? We can internally say that something is wrong. But if you don't actually speak out against it or do something to help correct it, then you're a bystander. And as we learn from the Holocaust, being a bystander in many ways enables those things to continue. So I just think it's so important that we think about that. And we think about the value of our Holocaust Center and of this commemoration and these types of commemorations around the world. And let me say, with that, one of the reasons I'm so proud that it's at Wagner College is Wagner does have a long history of speaking out and teaching against that type of intolerance and bigotry and of course, anti-Semitism. A lot of people don't know, but Wagner is one of the first small private colleges in the United States to become coeducational. In 1933. Most small private colleges were founded on a religious tradition, and most were strictly male. And then there were a handful of all women's colleges that sprung up at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, but most stayed separate, male colleges and female colleges. In fact, the Ivy League school, right, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, 1972, 73. Wagner became co-ed in 1933. And it's always been a forward-looking place like that. And in 1935, we graduated our first woman, and our first woman graduate at German Lutheran Wagner College was Jewish. Mabel Spitzer, her family emigrated from Russia right before World War I. And our president, when Mabel was here, and right up through World War II, was Clarence Stoughton. And Clarence Stoughton, very sort of coincidentally to what we're here for tonight, he wrote an editorial after Kristallnacht in 1938, saying that Americans needed to speak out against the rising tide of anti-Semitism, not just in Germany and in Europe, but in the United States, where he saw it as well. And one of the things that he also said, which I think is really important, is that intellect without character is more menacing than poison gas or high explosives. And so he always felt, and we've always felt at Wagner, that you're teaching students to learn, but also to do good, or at least to understand. And that's what I'm most proud about at Wagner, and of course with our Holocaust Center. But the last thing I want to leave you with, because some of that stuff's pretty heavy that I just said, is, we're also honoring the memory of Egon Salmon, and his family's here tonight. John just spoke. Son Henry's here. And I met with them a few months ago. And one of the things they told me about their dad, and I saw it when I met with him last year, is yes, he was on the St. Louis, survived the Holocaust, came to the United States, served during World War II, became very successful here, is that he was always positive and optimistic. He always had hope. And even when he spoke to students on Staten Island and here at Wagner about the things that happened, he always told his story, but he always spoke about the hope and all the good things that also happened to him in his life. I think you guys said, right, he was a glass half full kind of guy. And that's what I ask you to all remember. Yes, we must be vigilant, but we also have to be positive. And I think our students do that every day when they're here on this campus, and you're going to hear from some of them right now. And of course, they work with Lori too, and Laura and the Holocaust Center, and help to teach and keep that memory alive. So with that, I'm going to introduce our choir and Professor Juneau, who's the director of our choir.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nemirow. I am a member of the Wagner College Choir. I am a vocal performance and math double major, class of 2025. And I am also the vice president of Wagner College Hillel. The silent devotion from Ernest Luff's Sacred Service is considered one of the most beautiful settings of this traditional text. As a composer, his music reflected Jewish culture and liturgical themes, as well as European post-romantic traditions. Luff was a highly respected composer, teaching in such great schools as the Geneva Conservatory. He moved to the United States in 1938, where he became a professor of composition at the University of California at Berkeley. We hope the words of this devotion help to bring peace to all of those gathered here tonight. Sprint, a song by Mordecai Gebirtig, was written in response to the rise of anti-Semitism before and during the Second World War. The song was adapted by Jewish partisans during the Nazi regime, and whistling the tune became a code for adopted by imprisoned Jewish partisans.
Hello, my name is Jaylen Grey, and I'll be reading the poem for reading the song received. It burns, brothers, it's burning. Our poor little town of Hiddy burning. Furious winds blow, breaking, burning, scattering. And you stand around with your folded arms. Oh, you stand and look while our town burns. Oh, you stand and look while our little town
My name is Scott Salmon, and because my cousin Matthew is not here, I think I can definitively say that I was my grandfather Egon's favorite grandson. We have a short video tribute to my grandfather that we'd like to play for you. Then we're going to bring the family up for a candle lighting. We'll start with the video tribute. Thank you.
Rabban Yochanan prefers the words of Rabbi Elazar, a good heart. My grandfather was the pillar of our family and will remain such as a guiding example of how to have a good eye, to be a good companion, a good neighbor, have foresight, and possess a good heart. I have yet to meet a patriarch of his caliber. He taught me how to be a man, a gentleman, a husband, and a father. Every aspect of his life, from his personal accomplishments to his business endeavors, were conducted with respect, elegance, charity, and humility. As a child, I spent countless weekends and holidays with my grandfather, both in the office and at the house on Ocean Terrace. The memories, lessons, and fun that I had will be cherished forever. I'll always remember fishing with Grandpa up in Hemlock Ponds, taking the rowboat out to the lake, making a fire with Grandpa as soon as we entered the freezing house for the first time on our frequent winter visits. Golf, golf, and more golf. Lunches at the halfway mark of the course, and Thanksgiving dinners at the club. My grandfather showed us what it meant to be a family. He and Grandma are glue. Holidays were for the family. Passovers at their house, reading the Haggadah around the table with infamous "Mother, your turn to read," or "Father, your turn to read." Birthday celebrations. Praying with Grandpa at Temple Emmanuel. These are my memories. My grandfather possessed the survival gene. Our family of survivors stemming from a past spanning thousands of years of survival through the worst of humanity. Grandpa taught us to wear that badge with pride, to always look at the bright side of life. He was my inspiration to move to Israel, instilling in me that it is my responsibility to protect and keep safe my family from the tragic history of our family, of our people. This gene, this desire for life of survival, he passed this gift to his progeny.
When I asked him back in 2019 how he would like to be remembered, he said that he wanted to be remembered as someone who was kind, honest, and dependable. But he also specifically said that he wanted to be remembered as someone who thought the family was the most important thing that you could have. Now, this shouldn't be surprising. His most formative life experience was as a young teenager, traveling across half the globe, trying desperately to stay together with his family, knowing that if they failed, it likely meant death for all of them. And still, he then traveled back across the world to fight in a war to keep that family safe. He was a man who survived everything. 6 heart attacks, a stroke, colon cancer, quadruple bypass, brain surgery, even Adolf Hitler. And yet, he always seemed invincible. But it was still eventually his time to go. And it's a good reminder to us that none of us will live forever, no matter how good a life we lead. We only have so much time on this earth. And so the question becomes, what will we do with the time that we have? And how will we seek to be remembered? For me, all I want to do is make my grandfather proud. I wanted to know that his struggles to make it to America, to survive, were worth it. That we as a family are using the opportunity that we were given to accomplish great things.
I'm going to introduce our speakers before we go into the Q&A. First, we have Susan Slater. Susan Slater is the daughter of Bella Eisner, who was a passenger on the St. Louis at age 11. Bella was born in Nuremberg on April 30th, 1928, to Justin and Babette Eisner. Her younger sister, Ruth, was also on the St. Louis. When the St. Louis returned to Europe, they took refuge in France, where they were arrested in 1942 and sent to an internment camp. Justin was separated from his wife and children. His family learned years later that he was later sent to Auschwitz and killed. Babette, Bella, and Ruth immigrated to the United States in 1947. Bella was always openly talked about her Holocaust experience to her children and her grandchildren. Susan grew up in Washington Heights until she became married in 1982. She's the HR director of Winston Preparatory School, which operates in several states serving children with learning differences. She lives in Greenwich, Connecticut, and is absolutely nuts about dogs. Is that Susan?
Hello. So in 1990, a book was published called In the Shadow of the Holocaust, The Second Generation. And it talked about the effects of being the second generation to a Holocaust survivor. And that's something that I'm here to talk about this evening. But how do you determine cause and effect? How do I know what parts of my thoughts or my actions, my life choices are attributable to the fact that my mother had a Holocaust experience and was a survivor of the St. Louis? I don't remember a time that I didn't know about my mother's experience. It seems to me she always talked about it, and she talked about her 8 years in France living as a refugee. Looking back now, I wonder why I didn't ask her more questions, especially since she was so open about it. There's so many things I didn't ask her. There's so many things I don't know. When she was in her later years, she wrote her story in German, and it's a big, thick thing that she wrote. And I never had it translated. I've never read her story. The last movie I saw about the Holocaust was Schindler's List. And I thought it was important. I thought it was so important that every high school student in America should have to see that movie. But I haven't seen a World War II movie since, and I haven't read a World War II book since. And so I asked myself, why can't I face the history that she lived? Throughout my childhood, we grew up with another family where the dad in the family was a Holocaust survivor. He wasn't a St. Louis survivor. He had survived Auschwitz, and he had the tattoo of numbers on his arms, and he would never speak about his experiences. And when I asked my mother why he wouldn't speak about this, and of course I was a child at the time, she said that because what he went through was just so bad that he can't speak of it. And the implication of that, at least to me, was that she could speak about her experiences because they weren't so bad. I think she was mentally very, very tough, because your average person would have been crippled by what she went through. But she was able to focus on the big picture. She remembered kindnesses, she remembered support. She would tell funny stories during this terrible time. And so she found balance in what she had experienced. I'm not sure everybody could do that. When I was growing up, my parents spoke German in the house, but as our older relatives passed, less and less German was spoken. I grew up in Washington Heights, which was an enclave of German Jewish refugees. But I never learned to speak German. I never wanted to learn. I did learn to speak French, but I wonder, it's another one of those things I wonder about. Why was I never interested in learning German? Why have I traveled in Europe, but I've never been to Germany? My mother always felt culturally German, and she took a lot of pride in it. She was a great cook of German dishes. She used to go to Carl Amer's Butcher. She thought German products and German design were absolutely top-notch. And being on time, if not early, was primal. Incidentally, I reclaimed my German nationality several years ago. And isn't it interesting that my mother's generation of Jews in Germany were hiding and forging passports and trying to do anything to not be German. And here I am, one generation later, going to the authorities saying, here I am, can I have my papers? I think it's kind of interesting. So I think to a large extent, when you talk about anti-Semitism, I think in those days when I was growing up in Washington Heights and New York City in general, you were sort of shielded to an extent from anti-Semitism because everybody was German and Jewish in the local neighborhood, but even in New York in general, it was a big Jewish population. But I think it's different today, not just in Washington Heights, but in this country in general. It's really kind of scary. And as a member of the second generation, I think I'm particularly sensitive about anti-Semitism. And that's because I do think it could happen all again. Like other people may think, it's just some crazy people here and there. I think it can happen again. And maybe that's a result of being the second generation. I've seen it happen. And I think it can happen again. And it's a frightening thing. And it saddens and frightens me that more people, Jews and non-Jews, don't take a stronger stand against the erosion of simple decency and the denigration of diversity. And for anybody who had a parent sitting on the St. Louis, unable to dock anywhere, how can you not have some empathy for other people who are sitting on boats with nowhere to go today? I have negative and positive feelings about being Jewish, but I don't know if they're due to being second generation or due to other factors. Growing up, knowing about the Holocaust from a very young age made me wonder why anybody would want to be Jewish. And besides that, I thought it would have been a lot of fun to celebrate Christmas. I am very proud of Jewish culture, although I don't think there is a single Jewish culture. But of the things that I think are common among Jewish cultures is that there's a strong emphasis on family and education and food. I learned to value family from my mother, to whom nothing was more important. My father was born in Germany also, but he came here before the war. And he did not value education. He didn't want me to go to college because it would have been a waste of time and money. My role was to marry and procreate. Is that a Jewish influence? A German influence? Part of the culture and socioeconomic group that he was part of? I don't know. My brother was bar mitzvahed. I was never bat mitzvahed. Why wasn't it important for me to be bat mitzvahed? Why wasn't that something that my family valued? I will tell you that both my son and daughter have been bar and bat mitzvahed. I don't have much to say about Israel. I happen to have family in Israel. My grandfather, who was the one who was taken away to Auschwitz, had 7 brothers, one of whom emigrated to Israel. He got married, had a son, who got married, had children, who got married, had children. So by now I have lots of family in Israel. And I do think it's great that there is a thing called a Jewish homeland. But in reality, I'm not very knowledgeable about Israeli politics, but what I do know is a little bit troubling. And one of the things I've heard is that I might face more prejudice in Israel for not being Jewish enough than I face here for being Jewish. So the last thing I want to leave you with are the things that my mother left with me. And that's that there were always heroes, and you should be a hero. And by heroes, she meant that there were people who helped. When they went to France, they were not allowed to work in France because they were German. And so they lived in a little house where the people let them live in a few rooms in exchange for doing housework. They worked the fields for farmers for food. There was a time when there was a German group of soldiers who had occupied their little town, and my mother and her sister would go peel potatoes for them. And she told the people, they told the soldiers that they were from Alsace-Lorraine, which was French, but it explained why they had German accents, why my mother and her sister had German accents. And as an adult, my mother realized that the soldiers probably just pretended to believe them. But what they did was they allowed my mother and her sister to bring home food. And so what those people did, last story is that the night before the German soldiers came to take my mother's family to concentration camp, the French police came to her father and told him to flee. And he refused, but I still think, the point is that they broke those rules. The French soldiers did the right thing. They broke the rules. The soldiers who let them peel potatoes broke the rules. There were people who always helped and didn't do what they were told. And I think that was one of her important lessons. Do what's right, not necessarily what you're told. So this is my last slide and my takeaways. And it's interesting to me how much my takeaways are like the things that the Salmons just said about Egon. Be resourceful. There's no such thing as I can't. Think positive. The glass is half full. Count your blessings. And so that's what I want to leave you with.
Next up, we have Joan Loeb. Joan is the daughter of Liesl Joseph Loeb, the only child of Joseph and Lily Salmon Joseph. The Josephs lived in Reit, Germany, near Dusseldorf, and Liesl turned 11 when the St. Louis returned to Antwerp. Her father, Joseph, an attorney, was chairman of the passenger committee, which played an integral part of negotiations between the ship and the various countries unwilling to offer a safe haven for the people aboard. On the return to Europe, they were taken in by England, where Joan's grandfather was interned on the Isle of Man as a political prisoner until the family was able to immigrate to Philadelphia in September 1940. Liesl later became a graphic designer and was married 40 years to Hans Loeb, also a German Jewish refugee and World War II veteran. Joan grew up in Philadelphia. She worked in television and newspaper production before spending 20 years as an elementary teaching assistant in autistic support classrooms. Joan's family and the Salmon family here on Staten Island are related through our great-grandfathers who were brothers. Joan?
Hi. So I have some slides as well. They're more St. Louis related. I'm going to be talking more about my mom. I'll start with this. Just to start with, that's my mother at 10 years old, Liesl Joseph. It's her passport photo. And she has her hair behind her left ear. And she explained to me that Jewish women had to have their picture taken with their left ear showing. I don't still know why, but this is just one of many things that came up as she slowly unfolded her story to me and my younger brother. I knew by the time I was 8, I knew pretty much everything minus the visuals. My father, who left Germany in 1936, didn't talk about it at all. He came here and he brought his family over, but my mother used many opportunities to tell us something. November would come around. November was the month of her father's birth. He also died in November. And then, of course, there's Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was, I think, for everybody, the singular event that got things going. It certainly changed her life and her family's life forever. My grandfather's birthday was happening. They had a nice party for him. The table was all set with the best dishes and glassware. And the Gestapo came to the house the day before and asked to see his papers. My grandfather Joseph was a lawyer in the town of Reit, and the police knew him because he often had to visit people in jail. The next day after his party, they came and took him away. They took him to the local jail, not to a camp, fortunately. So he was in a local jail where they knew him, and he pretty much had a beat on things that were going on. That night, my grandmother took my mother out of the bed and they ran upstairs. They rented the top floor to tenants. They weren't Jewish. And they hid up there while listening to sanctioned vandalism of everything in the house. Breaking wood, shattering glass, everything just turned over and destroyed. Her grandmother often spent time with them. She was from Berlin. And that night she wasn't home, thank goodness, because they took a knife and ran it right through the coverlet on her bed. In my head, and I mean, poor mommy, that's what I thought. This has just always been in my head. What an awful thing. What an awful thing to go through. How can I make her feel any better? She grew up and she had a good childhood until she was 10. And she suddenly her friends weren't playing with her anymore and they were calling her names. And then she was being bullied. And as a 8, 9, 10-year-old, that just broke my heart. And I thought, I have to be better. I have to be a good girl. I have to do what I'm told. I have to bring home good grades. I have to do whatever she needs me to do to make her happy. And this has always weighed on me very heavily. After that happened, my mother was sent to Bonn to stay with friends and family, and she did not see her father again until they boarded a train to Hamburg, where they boarded the St. Louis. So she was separated from her parents because my grandmother stayed behind to do paperwork and figure out how they were going to get out of here, because my grandfather was told under no uncertain terms he needed to get out. He needed to get his family and get out. The sooner the better. I have here, these are visas that were sold to the passengers on the St. Louis. They were bogus. Don't remember what they paid for them, but they were bogus and they were not accepted and therefore couldn't get off the ship. I mean, there's more to it than that, but I have other things to tell you. So when they were in Cuba, they didn't get off the ship. And this is their, I don't want to call this. This is their number, kind of like a lottery. It was an immigration number, and you had to have a number in order to leave the country and go to the United States. It's dated 1938. So my grandfather kind of was already looking to leave, but you couldn't leave till your number came up. And I know that my mother's family, her aunts, her grandmother, by the time they got around to getting a number, it was way into the 70,000s, and that number never came up. this is the St. Louis. I remember also seeing headlines and hearing about civil rights things and riots in the 60s. And my mother took the opportunity always to explain to me what was going on and why these people were like us. And, you know, we have to be sympathetic to them. We have to support them. This is always a lesson. Again, over and over, every year, I heard more and I heard more. Personally, I had a great childhood. I grew up with my younger brother, Joel, in a row home in Philadelphia, a predominantly Jewish working class neighborhood. Had lots of friends. I went to school with them, and yet I knew somehow we were not alike. We weren't the same. There was something different about us. I couldn't put my finger on it when I was young. I kind of figured it out later that maybe it was because I was first generation American. I was raised by German Jews. These kids had grandparents who were American born. I mean, it wasn't a bad thing. It wasn't a bad difference, but it was something that was different. When my parents came to this country, this is some of my mother's artwork. So my parents came to this country and they took great pride in their German heritage. Absolutely. They spoke German when my grandparents were around or when they didn't want us to know what was going on. And they very much wanted to be American, particularly my mom. She didn't really even have an accent because she spent some of her childhood in England. And she really didn't have much of a German accent at all. But they never distanced themselves from German culture or identity. They came to Philadelphia and they lived in a North Philadelphia neighborhood where there were other German Jewish immigrants. And the young people gathered and formed a youth group, kind of a social club, the Central Club. And they did a lot of things. They went on picnics and they went to parties, and they were a very tight-knit group. And eventually folks got married. My mother met my father at the Central Club, and the women had a card group. They played for years and years on Tuesday nights and schmoozed. And between them all, there were 12 couples who kind of broke away from this group, who just were my family. They were like my family. My family itself was very small. And I'm still in touch with some of the kids. There were at least 24 of us, if not more. We had picnics. We were very much part of each other's lives. But the people in this group also had different experiences, and some did not have pride in German culture, wanted nothing more to do with it, and wouldn't want to talk about it. It just wasn't unanimous. I'm sure they wanted to forget. My dad helped to found, he was a co-founder of a German Jewish synagogue in Philadelphia called Tikva Chadosha, means New Hope. And the membership was entirely made up of Jewish German immigrants, mostly Holocaust survivors. And I observed way too many numbered arms going to services with my dad. And that was explained to me. Again, everything just kind of coming around more and more. This is why, and this is what. I realized that these folks had to be treated gently and kindly and with very much respect, because they all had a story. All of them had a story. So many stories of survival and bravery and loss. And it all weighed very heavily on me, as if I could have done something. I think it was, for my mom, it was very easy to talk about this. It's just who she was. To begin with, she idolized her father. He was her hero. And when he was home and she could see him, everything was going to be all right. Everything was safe. And on the St. Louis, there he was. I don't think she ever felt that any harm would come to her as long as her dad was there. He was made the head of the passenger committee, and that's him in the front. That's the passenger committee. And they communicated between the captain and the passengers. I have a lot of primary documents in regards to the St. Louis and the telegrams that were sent, because I guess because he was a lawyer and they kept everything. I have it's all pretty much at the Holocaust Museum now. The sun rose and set around her father. And on the St. Louis, particularly on the trip to Cuba, she had a great time hanging out with the kids and running around and seeing movies. Once the ship was turned around, the mood, of course, changed, but her dad was going to fix this. He was going to make everything all right. This was her belief. I felt like I knew this grandfather. I didn't know either of my grandfathers. She called him for us, Opazek, and I felt like I knew him even though I didn't. She always talked about him, how smart he was, how kind he was, generous, he was brave. This is how she kept him alive for us and for herself. And in doing so, she spoke about their experiences leading up to their voyage on the St. Louis until they finally stepped on American soil a year and a half later and beyond. My mother did a lot of public speaking about her experience on the St. Louis all over the country and in other countries as well. She was a really good speaker, and I've got letters about that too. Before 1933, my parents were, of course, German Jewish kids with a rich ancestry of German Jews going back many, many generations. You can't just shed that, even though you're getting kicked out of a place that's been home. It's your family. I can't even begin to understand how confusing that had to be. But as far as my upbringing, I guess some of the experience of the Holocaust, of course, touched me, as well as the Germanness of my upbringing, because they were very strict, very German in that way. Their Jewish identity towards and attitudes towards Israel, absolutely the experience impacted them, but not in the same way. My father, I think, was very much a Zionist, and if he didn't have any familial responsibilities, I believe he would have headed straight to Palestine. My mother wanted to be American. She was American, but she was very involved, both of them, in Jewish causes and organizations in Philadelphia. Each of them were president of either the men's club or the synagogue or the sisterhood. And it was very easy, I think, for them to identify with Israel, because Israel was a homeland, a place where Jews were welcome. And they had just come from where they aren't welcome. The place where Jews were welcome. And a little country that had to fight to survive, as it is doing to this day. I do feel a connection to Israel, but I'm conflicted by its politics today. I spent 2 months in Israel on a program called Summer in Kibbutz that I think the Jewish Federation ran. And it was it was an unusual and enriching experience. However, we did little road trips, and we went to Hebron to see the cave of Machpelah, and we had rocks thrown at the bus by the Arab residents there. And then we had a walk through Mea Sharim, more rocks. I didn't get it. They threw rocks at us. I'm thinking, we're all Jewish. What's going on here? A real hard time with that. And I really don't have any strong desire to go back. It was a good trip, and I've been there, but I don't really want to go back. Lessons I've learned, well, be a mensch, look after the old folks, give tzedakah, be vigilant. That's a big one, because this could happen again. And like Susan, I totally agree. And this is something I impart to my kids. I have 2 exceptional boys, Asha and Eden. And if anything, be a mensch, be vigilant, because things are cooking up again, and it all makes me very nervous. I pushed back a lot against my Jewish education, my Jewish upbringing. It felt like a burden to me. I married out of the faith, certainly not something a good Jewish girl is supposed to do. And it did bring some heartbreak and disappointment. But my parents never disowned me. They never gave up on me. They welcomed my husband into the family. Kids were raised Jewish. They both had a bar mitzvah. And my mother got right on telling her stories to them. And I felt like I did not want to push them that hard. I didn't say as much. I think it had an effect on both of them, and not necessarily positive. I think that they also wanted to push back against who they were. It's important to me that they knew where they come from. And if there are ever any grandchildren, they're going to know who and where they come from. I just didn't want them to carry the same guilt that I carry, and I still do, but I'm old enough to deal with it pretty much. This experience here, this is Havana, by the way, seen from the ship, has made me think a lot about how I grew up and who I am. As time passes, my children are still Jewish. You know, it's not going to change. But the price that was paid was way too dear for us to ever forget. And I thank you for coming.
So we have about 20 minutes for a Q&A, but before we get started with that, I would like to give the first few minutes to some of our special guests who are joining us over Zoom, some of the women who are aboard the St. Louis. We'll start off with Cantor Judith Copel-Steele. Cantor, if you'd like to speak for a minute and tell us, talk to us a little bit about your experience. I think you're on mute. You're on mute. You need to unmute yourself. She's got it. You should be unmuted.
Am I on?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Judith Steele. I like to use my maiden name also, which is Copel. As Judith Copel and Joseph Ingard and Jacob Copel, we boarded the St. Louis along with 937 passengers. So the beginning starts before I was born in Berlin. There were beatings of Jews and the infamous Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And this happened on November 9th and 10th of 1938, when the Nazis vandalized Jewish homes, as they said before, torched synagogues, and killed nearly 100 Jews. Some 30,000 Jewish men were arrested, including my father, and he was sent to Nazi concentration camp number 7, Fresnes-sur-Sarthe, in the northwest part of France. After 2 weeks, he was informed that he would be released on the condition that he leaves Germany within 8 weeks, or he and his family would be arrested. After the war, the camp Fresnay-sur-Sarthe was destroyed and rebuilt into a famous resort and tourist attraction. I was 14 months old when my parents and my grandfather managed to book passage on the luxury SS St. Louis, bound for Havana Harbor. Aboard the ship, they felt safe and secure, not knowing that the St. Louis was to become a large prison. My parents' world was quickly changing. The ship stayed for 10 days in Havana Harbor and only 22 souls disembarked. According to government officials, our visas were invalid and we were turned away. We tried to enter Cuba, to actually Miami, but again, we were told to move on because we were in violation of US territory, according to the US State Department. We tried other countries, including Canada. When we asked the Minister of Immigration in Canada if he could accept at least some of the passengers, he replied, "None is too many." The ship finally returned to Europe and was allowed to port in Antwerp, Belgium. After that, we went to France, where we rented an apartment in a town called Nye in the Pyrenees. We stayed together until September 9th of 1942. Early one morning, or I don't know, in the middle of the night, there was a knock on our door, and it was the Vichy police coming to arrest us. This I remember. I was 4 years old. Why did they come to arrest us? Because we were Jewish. I remember my grandfather was in his bed crying uncontrollably. At that time, I didn't understand. I was only 4 years old. I tried to console him as a 4-year-old could. I said goodbye to him and went with my parents. I recall seeing my mom whisper something to our landlady, whom I later called Maman. I wonder, what did my mother say to her? What could she have said? We were taken to a detention camp in the south of France called Gurs. There I remember soldiers standing with machine guns. After that, we were moved to another camp called Rivesaltes. One day in Rivesaltes, my mother was playing with me, and I cannot forget the sadness in her eyes when she said to me, "Judy, Mommy and Daddy have to go away, and we don't know when we will be back." Of course, a child cannot comprehend this, and I just wanted to play. As we played, the sadness in her eyes remained. Later that day, my father said, "Judy, let's go for a walk." "Okay," I replied, and my mother gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and cheerfully told us, "Have a good time." She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, actually meaning goodbye. My dad and I walked into the darkness until we came to a lit room where someone greeted us. They gave me something warm and sweet to drink. Maybe it was hot chocolate. I held my dad's hand with my left hand. He pointed to my right side in order to distract me. "Look over there, Judy." I looked to my right side, and then I heard him say, "Just a minute, Judy." And he let go of my hand. My hand was picked up again. And when I turned around, someone else had picked up my hand. My father was gone, and I never saw him and my mother again. It was in that instant that my life changed forever. The next morning, I woke up to find the Rivesaltes barracks empty. Maman's husband came for me and brought me back to his house. All the prisoners were put on trains to Drancy and then to Auschwitz. I was covered with sores, My mom had to douse the sores with iodine. I do remember screaming from the sting of the medication. My mom brought me to a doctor to look me over, and he said that I suffered from malnutrition, and I wasn't sure if I would survive. I believe my mom's loving, healing hands made me recover. And so my war years were spent in the home of a French Catholic family who loved me unconditionally and didn't even think that their lives were in danger. We would have all been killed had the Nazis found us out. I have a lot to think about my mom. My mom was my mother in every way. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'd like to certainly be open for questions.
We're going to go next to my great aunt Edith, Edith Salmon.
Oh, Sonya.
You lose her? Is that? You have to go to the participants. Oh, we may have lost her then. Oh yeah, we can see if we can find her in the meantime. All right, then we will go next to. Okay, yeah. Well, then we'll go to Sonya Geismar. Yeah, if you could just speak to us for just a minute or two about your experience, that'd be great. Thank you. Yeah, just muted. Sonia, we can't hear you. If you're, we need you to unmute yourself.
There
you go.
Good now.
Perfect.
Thank you. Going to speak about Kristallnacht because that is a memory that I have forever. The Nazis barged into our home, and I remember them overturning furniture, ruining the china and crystal, opening up drawers and throwing things to the floor. And eventually they went upstairs to the bedroom, my parents' bedroom, and tore up the pale green down quilts. And the down was all over the room. And of course that happened in all cases where the homes were invaded. And it was particularly an invasion of the privacy of the parents. As my mother held me in her arms, I started to cry because I saw a photo of my father on the floor. The photo had been torn, and I thought that meant my father had died. He was taken away to Dachau that morning, and he suffered there with beatings, with starvation, with terrible treatment. He was released on the condition that he would leave Germany. My mother booked passage on the St. Louis and received tourist landing permits. Those that permitted us to stay in Cuba until our numbers for the United States would be called. However, they were declared invalid by the government because the President Brew discovered that the immigration secretary had sold these these landing permits. And that's why the law was changed. You could not enter Cuba unless you had the signatures of the Department of State and Labor, plus a deposit of $500 per person, which was impossible because you left Germany with virtually nothing, penniless. And that's why the passengers were turned away. I don't want to take much of the speaking time, but I'll be able to answer any of your questions. Thank you for listening.
Were we able to find? You know, if we were able to find it. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Okay.
If Eva Wiener knows how to unmute herself, she can unmute.
Uh,
Eva Wiener, but I can't find her.
Eve, if you're there, if you could unmute yourself. Okay.
I'm now unmuted. I am here.
Are
you referring to me? Can you hear me? Oh. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yep.
Thank you for the invitation. On the photograph that you saw of Lisa Loeb, the little girl that is being held by her mother, that's you. Right next to Liesel is none other than myself. Right. I was 10 months old when my mother carried me aboard the ship. But I'm very fortunate in the fact that they told me all about the trip, and I'm fully aware of what they went through and how we got there. And of course, my story goes beyond that. We were one of the few that were permitted to go to England after the ship was turned back to Europe. And I spent the entire war until 1946 in London, living in bomb shelters. But of course, my life was nothing compared to what it would have been had I gone to Belgium, Holland, or France. We were one of the lucky ones to have gone to England. Again, when Sonya said that we had no money, my father left behind 3 thriving businesses, all of which were confiscated by the German government. We took what few things we were permitted to take with us, and of course, no cash at all. But life in England was difficult, to say the least, but the most secure of all of the 4 countries. I came to the United States with my parents in 1946, arriving on Memorial Day weekend, where there was a dock strike and we could not depart from the ship. It was very frightening. It reminded us, of course, of Havana Harbor. But fortunately, the dock strike ended and we were able to leave. I have lived most of my childhood in Queens, New York, and went to Queens College, married a man from New Jersey, and now live at the Jersey Shore. I make it my business to talk to students as well as adults about the significance of the St. Louis, because I think it is a lesson that is what was to preclude the terrible outcome of the Holocaust. The St. Louis was chosen specifically by Nazi propaganda to show the world that the Jews were expendable cargo and that nobody really cared. They then went on to be able to enforce what was going to be the final solution to eliminate the Jewish people, and the world would not care. So as I said, even though I was very young, I still feel that I was a very much part of a very important part of history.
Oh, yes.
I also knew your mother, Liesel, quite well. She and I appeared on several programs. She from Philadelphia and I from New Jersey, as well as in Cherry Hill, where she spoke quite often. I had the honor of being, I thought, one of her friends. I think very fondly of her. That's basically my story, and I hope also to answer any questions that you might have.
Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time for questions, but I think we have time for two questions. So if anyone has a question for any of the women that spoke tonight, I guess we could start with anyone here, and then we can go to Zoom. Any question? No? Okay. Yes.
I don't know if it happened to us, but I don't know if at that time Palestine was accepting, refugees. Was there any discussion or any documentation about going to Palestine to institute folks, other than the ones that you say was?
So the question was about whether there was any attempts to immigrate to Palestine, or was in Palestine at the time. I'm not sure if any of our speakers know.
I have something to, yes. My father was one of 8, and 5 of the 8 were able to go to Palestine at that time in 1936. They saw what was happening, and my father's siblings and his parents emigrated to Palestine at the time. So there was a definite impetus to leave Germany and go to Palestine at the time.
Instead of back to Belgium, to Palestine.
No, the British was allowed.
And it also wasn't, I mean, St. Louis was in the waters of the North Atlantic. Palestine had to come out of.
Well, they had to go to the Mediterranean.
Okay.
The Zionist group tried to get Jews illegally into Palestine, but there was a lot of, the British had blocked immigration, just like the United States.
Does anyone else have another question? We can go to Zoom. Sorry? Yeah, someone?
It is an honor to be here tonight with all of you wonderful survivors. And I know Henry and Linda from Park Avenue Synagogue, where we are members. My uncle Gunther, who was 10 years old, is in that iconic photo of the children of the St. Louis. I have met you, Eva Wiener, personally. And Judy, you grew up with my cousins, Evelyn and Richie Wolf, with my uncle, Hugo, and my aunt, I can't remember my aunt's name. When you shared the house in Lake Apatcong, my uncle Gunther Joel with his parents, my grandparents Leon and Johanna Joel, were following Billy Joel's grandparents, Carl and Maida Joel, who had gone to Cuba in January of 1939, and had with Bill's father, who was about 15 at the time. And they had written to my grandparents saying, come quick. So my grandparents, unbelievable to me, booked first class passage. And they, like some of you, ended up in France. They had a choice. They could have gone to England. My mother was already there. as a 19-year-old nanny to a Quaker family. But my grandfather, who was apparently very authoritarian, wanted to go to France because he had fought with the French and thought they would protect the Jews, which of course they did not. Gunther was taken into the Ose network of orphanages in France until he got here in 1947, sponsored by Billy Joel's grandparents. And my grandparents went into hiding. And like some of you have already indicated, my grandparents also were picked up in that roundup in 1942. Sad story. My parents met in England, and I was born in England, and we came here in 1945. And I never knew anything about this until the first book, The Voyage of the Damned, came out in 1972. And that's when I first learned of this. Gunther was furious about how FDR did not allow the passengers to come into the United States. And in that iconic photo of the children on the St. Louis in Belgium in the first stop, Morris Troper is in the photograph, and Herbie Carliner is right in front of him. And you know Herbie. Eva, you were probably in the reunion in 1989 in Miami, and you probably were too, Judy. And Herbie and I became friends in 1989 when the New York Times published the story about the reunion. And that's how I started getting connected with this fabulous network. And I came to meet Henry because we had an event at the synagogue talking about immigrants from Syria. And I stood up and said, my grandparents from the St. Louis, et cetera. And someone came up to me afterwards and said, we know people from our synagogue who are descendants of people who were on the St. Louis. And that's how I got to meet Henry and Linda. And then we had a reunion with Egon and Marie. And another person, a member of the synagogue, who was also a teenager on the St. Louis. I have read the books 3 times over the past many decades, so I'm very familiar with the story. And I have no forgiveness for FDR.
I'm going to call up the chair of the High Society, Forensic Order. Here. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm just so glad to see so many of you here for all sorts of reasons. I think the most important is that people want to know. They want to know the stories of survivors. They want to know how that has impacted us now and how it will impact us in the future. So I'm Fern Zager. I'm the relatively new chairperson of the Wagner College High Society. And as many of you know, the High Society's mission is to strengthen the ties between Wagner College and the Jewish community by supporting academic studies and our very vibrant, wonderful Holocaust Center. We also support Hillel and other programs. And most importantly, we support efforts to educate continuing generations on the ramification of prejudice, bias, anti-Semitism, and racism. Tonight's Kristallnacht presentation is extremely important. Laurie Weintraub, who you'll hear from in a moment, recently shared an article about, in Germany, they no longer call this Kristallnacht. Why? Because it sounds too nice. Crystal is glass, and it's pretty, and it's good. There's nothing about what happened on November 9th, November 10th, and before and certainly after, that's nice. And so the current generation is holding their parents, parents, past generations responsible. And they call it pogrom, pogrom, to destroy, to eliminate. There are other ideas that they're playing with to describe this horror, but Kristallnacht is just too nice. So it becomes extremely important because we've touched on this. There's a rise in anti-Semitism. There's a rise in Holocaust deniers. There's a rise in prejudice, racism. We're seeing this everywhere. We're seeing it in New York. We're seeing it throughout the United States. We're seeing it throughout the world. And it's frightening because we know what can happen if we don't stand up and do something. So it's incumbent on us to teach the lessons of the Holocaust, to hear the stories of survivors, to remember and learn so that we do everything we can to prevent future genocides, wherever they may be, and to whomever those targets might be, whether it's here in the US or abroad. Elie Wiesel said, once you know something, you cannot unknow it. And if you know it, you are responsible to do something. And so we want to pass on that message so people know they can't say it didn't happen. They might say they don't believe, as somebody that I know, a survivor, heard from a teacher in a class that she presented to, didn't believe it. Well, you know, the atrocities were unbelievable. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be teaching this. It makes it even more important to show what can happen in the face of hate, in the face of ignorance, in the face of bias. I'm extremely grateful to the Salmon family for their ongoing generosity and their undying commitment to learn from the experience of their own family, especially their father, their grandfather, Egon, a blessed memory, and to keep this going. Some of you may know that I'm a wife, a mother, a grandmother, and also a child of Holocaust survivors. My mother survived the Warsaw Ghetto, 3 concentration camps, escaped from Poland afterwards because it was a dangerous place, and went on to get her PhD in comparative literature, writing about the poetry of the Holocaust. And my father escaped from the Vilna Ghetto and fought with Abba Kovner, with the partisans. So I come from very strong stock and have gotten the message and hope to carry that on from generation to generation, l'dor v'dor, that we have to pass on the lessons of the past so that we don't repeat them. And what better place to take on this type of a challenge? Okay, it's a charge to all of you to carry on that message, but I think you wouldn't be here if it wasn't important to you, right? But we have to spread that out to others, right? So what better place to do this at a college, you know, at Wagner College. And I'm sincerely grateful especially to the staff, to the faculty, to the support of Wagner College, to Laurie Weintraub, to Laura Marowitz, to Caitlin, Karen, Ruda, Patrick, I can go on and on. There's tremendous support here at the college for the work of the Holocaust Center and the work to combat prejudice, anti-Semitism, racism, and to build strength and diversity. So I'm very glad that you're all here to witness the stories that you've heard today and to carry their messages, the messages that you've heard, to carry them to others so that we can say never again. So thank you. The next to come up, Lori and Laura, thank you.
So it's getting late. I just want to very quickly invite you to our next event and say a few closing words. So our next event is on November 29th, laughing off the trauma of anti-Semitism. And I don't know if you're following all the different ways that comedians are responding to some of the most recent anti-Semitic remarks, but this will go back even further to Mel Brooks and others. And it will be paired with wine, and it is only an in-person event, not on Zoom. So you have to come and drink wine with us on November 29th. I want to add to the comments of Fern and others about two transformative moments for me tonight. So one is, I want to thank my colleague, Thomas Juneau, for bringing in the choir. Just thank you, yeah. Yesterday, I saw 50 students and Hebrew school teachers singing Tehillim for the souls of the 6 million who died in the death camps and by bullet in the pits and in the forests. In our Holocaust Center space, it was very moving with non-Jewish students surrounding them. And tonight you heard Jewish and non-Jewish students singing Hebrew prayer. And I just think that this is something that I could not have imagined when I first came to Wagner. I think it's just a beautiful part of our Kristallnacht event. And if I remember correctly, it was really Marie Salmon's idea that from now on we would incorporate music into all of the Kristallnacht events. So thank you for encouraging us to do that. And thank you for my colleagues. The second transformative moment, actually, in a way, I want to say thank you to Egon. When he first spoke here in 2010 was the first time that I realized that the Holocaust was not just an international event, but it was a Staten Island event. And what I mean by that is that there were Staten Island survivors, our neighbors, who had Holocaust stories. The story of the St. Louis was in the pages of the Staten Island Advance. You can go and look at editorial cartoons and different people's opinions about whether the Jews from Europe should go to the United States or to Palestine, or what we should do about this crisis, and specifically about the voyage of the St. Louis. And I realized it was time to reach out to local Staten Island Holocaust survivors. And tonight, in part thanks to I think Joni, who shared the photo, right? And then Eva, who saw the photo where we referred to the baby, and she reached out to me. I realized that there's another community that Egon brings us in contact with, and that is the community of survivors of the St. Louis. So it took us 8 commemorations to realize that there's an international community that still includes living survivors of the St. Louis. And I definitely think we need to continue to do work with them and bring their stories into our Holocaust Center, because I believe we're the only college in the country that has an annual commemoration that includes both Kristallnacht and the St. Louis. So that is one of the unique things about us. And I want to thank all of you for being part of it. And I hope you, like I, heard not just about the survivors of the St. Louis, but that some of those survivors lost their grandparents in the Holocaust, and that 254 of those original 987 passengers were murdered in the Holocaust. So that is something that it's not just a story of refugees, it's also a story of the trauma of the Holocaust, particularly for those who landed in France and Belgium rather than in England. So for these reasons, and thanks to both of you for your talk and reminding us that the world knew about the St. Louis, right? Even on Staten Island, Staten Islanders in June 1939 read those newspapers. They knew what would we have liked them to have done? What should we be doing? What can we learn from this? Both in terms of remembrance and in terms of action. So thank you so much for coming. And I don't, Scott, did you want to say a closing word? Or thank you again to the Salmon family for everything that you have done to make this event possible. Thank you to Ernie Bueller, who's one of our survivors, who was born in Nuremberg and is a survivor of the Holocaust. And thank you to all the second generations who are here. And please continue to stay in touch with and support the work of the Holocaust Center. We need all of your donations, large and small, to continue to do this work. We really appreciate everybody. So thank you so much. And we will see you on November 29th with wine. Great thanks to the Kim and Dr. Victor Avis for sponsoring the wine at that event. Thank you.
If anyone has not seen the Holocaust Center and would like me to walk them over there, I'd be happy to do that now. I'd be happy to walk you over there.